cosa leggerai? Con che libro affascini il tuo cuore?
This show is Love, Lust, and Laughter. And my guest is Dr. Ashley Mader. Hello, Ashley.
Hello, how are you?
Good. It's so nice to have you, a brand new guest on the Love, Lust, and Laughter show. And Ashley, I want to tell people how we met. I was promoting and marketing my book on your program, and that was a little over a week ago. And I just knew that you would be the perfect guest because you specialize in aging and sexuality. Let me just tell the listeners a little bit more about you. You're a psychotherapist, a sex therapist, an educator and consultant, and you do specialize in older adults. And your private practice focuses on older adult sexuality and aging transitions. You have a blog called SHINE. That's a great acronym, which stands for Sexual Health in a New Era.
Yes.
And so you got your doctorate in human sexuality, and you also have your master's in social work, and you are back in Massachusetts. I'm in Seattle, and you're in Massachusetts, and it's so good to have you on this program.
I'm happy to be on it. Thank you.
You're welcome. So I thought we would call this program Keeping Sex Alive for Life. And I'd really like to, I know from our conversations off the air, but I'd like for you to share with the audience how you came to focus on aging and sexuality, because you're a woman who is young. You're half my age. But I started focusing on aging and sexuality when I was just a tiny bit older than you. So I think it's great to have more gerontologists in the field focusing on aging and sexuality. But how did it happen for you that you became interested?
Well, when I was in my graduate program was a dual program, a master's in social work and a master's in human sexuality, and then I went on and got my doctorate. And I originally went into the field of human sexuality thinking that I wanted to work with couples, which I still do. But I wasn't really thinking about older adults, to be completely honest. And I was asked if I wanted to do a stipend, do an internship for a stipend, which like a grant, and for a starving graduate student at the time, any free money was good money. Honestly,
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, "Do you want to work with older adults?" And it was something called the Hartford Foundation, which promoted social work students to work with older adults. I'm like, yeah, I'll try it out. And my very first internship was at a senior center in West Philadelphia, and I was doing sexuality groups and all sorts of things there, and I really, really loved working with older adults. And then the second year, I had the ability to do two internships. I had one at a geropsychiatry unit in Philadelphia, and then I had another one at another senior center where I was doing singles groups and sexuality groups. And I had such a blast. It was just fun. Mm-hmm. It didn't feel like work. And just being able to sit in and hear people's stories, and I fell in love with it. And kind of the rest is history. I did my dissertation on older adults' experiences of their sexuality, and I interviewed 20 older adults on how they experienced their sexuality as they aged. And if anyone could, it was rewarding research. It was extremely rewarding. And so now that's why I am still working with older adults. I mean, I see all ages, but my primary focus is older adults.
And didn't you find that these older adults that you interviewed for your dissertation and even now in your work, that they're so appreciative of talking to someone with knowledge about older sexuality, and and maybe even some of them are kind of proud to, and I hope they are, proud to still be sexual. They haven't folded up their tent.
No, absolutely. I thought it was really interesting how open they were to me. And I thought it was interesting because I was at the same senior center doing a lot of the interviews, and I got to hear so many interesting stories. Who had a crush on who, and who was like, oh, do I ask this person out? It was just an interesting, look into their world. And my thought is, their world is not much different than anyone's world when it comes to sex and sexuality. And just being able to, they were so grateful that I was asking and they were getting help around it. Some of them were coming out for the first time. They were so excited to share their stories and actually have their concerns addressed.
Exactly, that they're talking to somebody who is empathic and compassionate and knowledgeable. And too many older people will go to a doctor, and the doctor, first of all, may not even ask them about their sexuality if they're over, let's say, over 60. Sometimes it's even over 50. They won't even ask them, and doctors, of course, need, in general, it's improved. I have to say it's improved in the last 15 years, I think, but over the years I've heard some really disturbing stories about, an older woman going to her doctor and complaining about her lack of desire and just relax, have a glass of wine. And it's so much more complicated than that. And information is so important. So isn't that true that so many doctors just aren't educated enough in the field of human sexuality?
Yeah, obviously, they're not, whether it's sex and aging, they're definitely not educated in that, but just sexuality in general.
Yes.
There's a discomfort around that for a lot of healthcare professionals. They're anything but sex positive at times. They can be very shaming, which can be so detrimental and, causes older adults not to get the help they need.
Yes, because, and in fact, so many of these older adults came out of families of origin where there was some shaming around sexuality, and where the parents did not offer the facts of life or any sex education at all. And even in schools, it's often limited. So shame is often surrounds sexuality, and when shame can be erased or at least lessened or explained or worked through, it makes a huge difference. Talk a little bit more about shame in your experience with a client or two.
So a lot of the shame that I hear, and I hear from both men and women, it's the sexual scripts that they were taught when they were very young, especially the old script of be a lady. And I think I even heard that a little bit when I was growing up, because I had older parents. Be a lady. And I'm like, what the heck does that mean even now? I mean, I don't know. But I think a lot of that. So I would hear a lot of women talk about, I had a hard time actually in my dissertation finding women to interview. And I think that has to do with shame of, you don't talk about sex. That's not what ladies do. So it was difficult to find women to talk with. And I remember talking to one woman in particular. She went to her primary care doctor. She was on dialysis, so that causes vaginal dryness. And she was asking him about sexual discomfort. And he got really, really uncomfortable. And he goes, that's not what I'm for. That's what you need to talk to your...
that's not what I'm for, yeah.
Yeah. And she never ended up bringing it. He goes, that's what gynecologists are for. That's not what I'm for. He got extremely uncomfortable, and she never got her concern addressed. She never went to her gynecologist. So I've heard that with men. I hear a lot about how sexual side effects of their medications are not even addressed. Just shaming, like, oh, you don't want to do that, or, oh, are you a little too old for that? That type of language, which is just downright ageist. So yeah, I hear, and I don't hear it as much now as I did even like 5 years ago. So I think things are shifting. But a lot of the people that I've known as like colleagues that are extremely sex positive, and I worked with a woman in her 80s, and she made it a priority to force her doctor to listen to her about her sex life and be like, you need to be comfortable with this because this is important to me and it better be important to you as well. And that takes a lot of guts, but like it was important, and she was wanting to train him, basically. She was also a therapist. She wanted to train him to be able to talk to other older adults who would not be comfortable to advocate for themselves.
And was he trainable?
He was. She said that she worked with him long enough that he was trainable, and I think she even started giving some workshops around it as well. So, yeah, he was trainable. Doctors can be trainable. I think they just need the education. I think it starts at the beginning of med school if it's in the medical profession, whether it's psychology. I think there should be a class for any. I want to say helping professional. They need to have a sexuality education class.
Absolutely, they do. Well, my introduction to aging and sexuality really started with my grandmother, Helen, and I put this in my book, in the acknowledgments, my book, Love in the Time of Corona. And my grandma Helen, I acknowledged her because she was still sexually active well into her early 90s. And I asked her, Grandma Helen, when will sexual desire end? This is way before I went to graduate school, so I hadn't studied sexuality yet. And she said, well, when does it end? I'll let you know, she said with a smile. And then I had the good fortune of working with a Dr. Walter Bortz, an internist and a geriatrician. And this was in the early 90s. And that was a wonderful experience. He's written a book called We Live Too Short and Die Too Long. And one of the chapters was Snow on the Roof, Fire in the Furnace. And I talked to him about that. I heard him lecture at the Palo Alto Senior Center, where I was living in Palo Alto at the time. And I talked to him afterwards, and I said, you don't have that. Now, this book was published in, I want to say 1991. I said, you don't have that much information about senior sexuality. And he said, no, there aren't enough studies. So going back, and so we teamed up and did some presentations, and then later wrote these studies up, and they were published in journals of gerontology. So that's how I got to call myself a gerontologist. And these were wonderful, eye-opening experiences working with Dr. Bortz and teaching these classes, these seminars at the Palo Alto Senior Center, which maybe it's because it's near Stanford, but these people, even in the early 90s, were very, very well educated. A lot of the women had gone back to school, had gone to graduate school after they were married. Think of the age cohort at that time. It was a little different. So we got very good responses, questionnaires, and we followed them up 6 months later. And then we did a series of lectures with SIRS, Sons in Retirement, on male sexuality. And in those days, for both the seniors at the Palo Alto Senior Center and for the SIRS, Sons in Impotence or erectile dysfunction, was a huge problem, and side effects of medications. And mind you, this is before Viagra, which was approved by Pfizer in, I still remember the month and the date, April of 1998. And so, but these guys would say, well, yes, I'm on a medication for high blood pressure, and when I get enough courage to bring up the erection problem with my doctor, he said, well, would you rather have a heart attack or an erection? That talk about dismissive.
Yeah.
So, and there were so many other things that just opened my eyes to how wonderful it is to work with older folks. And now I'm one of them, and I have continued to practice what I preach, and it has made my aging so much better to remain sexual, and it's so healing. And we're about to go to talk about pandemic sex because the whole world is grieving, but you and I had fun talking off the air about our interest in this field, and it's a very rewarding field because when we talk about quality of life, if people remain healthy as they age, they're much more likely to have sex, and it's healing sex, and it's good sex if they remain sexual. But it is a use it or lose it kind of thing because erections are good for erections, and as far as the vagina is concerned, the vaginal lining, the PC muscles and all of that stay stronger if the woman's having regular intercourse. So all of these things. Anyway, we're both enthusiastic about working with older folks and their sexuality.
Yes.
It's very rewarding.
It's extremely rewarding, and it's I don't know, I find it's something I never get bored with.
Mhm. Yeah, that's very good. We I think that we need more gerontologists. So just for the listening audience, a geriatrician is an MD. A gerontologist is somebody like Ashley or myself with a PhD. And maybe it expands beyond that. Do you know in terms of the rules of being able to call yourself a gerontologist?
I am not sure. I mean, I know that obviously geriatrician, that's something you can, like for med school, but I don't think there is. I think there's some people, I think that people can have specializations in geriatrics or gerontology, but I don't think there's any other I don't think so. I think you can, as long as you are open to working with older adults and are knowledgeable, and if you've even trained, or I think that kind of can put you as a gerontologist, because I think there's a lot of social workers out there. There was no gerontology part of my training necessarily. I think I took one class on aging. I don't think that would make me a gerontologist, but my continued research interest and learning about it would make me more of a gerontologist, I would say.
That's right. That's right. And also in my graduate schools, there was no older gerontology kind of class either. But I figured once I was published in medical journals with Dr. Bortz, then I could do it. And I've continued to study, and it's been just so rewarding. And I'm so glad I did it because here I am, let's see, about a little, not quite 40 years later, and I have continued to practice what I preach, and my husband and I are really benefiting and enjoying, this is the segue, and enjoying pandemic sex.
Yes.
In this case, it's not that the whole world is grieving. It is that, but for us personally, it has a little bit of, wow, you know, let's go for the gusto.
Yeah.
We're both in our 70s, and we recognize that, mortality is an issue, and of course we're both more prone or more vulnerable to get COVID-19, so we really have to be careful with quarantining and so on. But it makes all the difference to remain sexual as an older person. And so we're going to talk a little bit about pandemic sex, and let's do it right now. Do you use that term at all in your practice?
Pandemic sex. Yes, because I've had couples who, it's just interesting. The couples, a lot of the couples some of them are saying, oh, there's going to be a lot of pandemic babies born, the couples that I work with that are not older. And then the other part of the couple is like, oh, no, there won't be because there's so much stress. No one's going to want to have sex. But then I hear a lot of my older clients they don't have as much responsibilities at home. They are actually having more sex.
Yes, and in fact, my book, Love in the Time of Corona, a sex therapist's advice for couples in quarantine, the target audience really are more middle-aged couples, or at least couples who don't have small children at home, or even teenagers. But teenagers aren't quite as disruptive as small children in terms of the couples well, it depends on the teenager, I guess, but in terms of the couple's intimacy. But I think pandemic sex, sex in the face, we're all grieving and about what's happening in our world. And so sex can actually represent a need for reassurance and a determined affirmation of life when confronted by death or loss. Because being sexual is a reminder that one is still alive. Yes. And others need affirmation that they're still attractive. And that's true for singles, too. Singles in this pandemic are having a little more trouble getting their sexual needs met, but that's another topic. We'll stay with the older people who are coupled. But don't you think, you feel so alive when you're being sexual?
Absolutely, and I think that is what a lot of, because like the world is grieving, but I think this is, a lot of times it's like the sexual part, the sexual connection, even just the touching, that connection, I think is so important right now, and it does make you feel more alive, especially in this very unsure time that's really scary. So I think the sexual connection has been extremely important for people during this time, or any time for that matter, but during this time, especially during the pandemic.
Yes, and they can feel the intimacy, and it really makes a difference. So let's talk some about women, and let's go. We're going to talk about the pandemic and how that figures in to all of these things, but let's talk about women and how to get going when you don't feel the urge, because this is pretty common for postmenopausal women. And if we're talking about aging and sexuality, we need to talk about postmenopausal women. And I, for one, have been on bioidentical hormone replacement therapy for quite a few years now, and I was fortunate because there isn't breast cancer in my family, and some research indicates that if you're taking estrogen replacement, it could, if there's cancer present, it could feed the cancer. But I'm taking the bioidentical estradiol, and my body has receptors for it, and progesterone, again, bioidentical, and testosterone. And testosterone is not only is good for the libido, but it gives you energy and a sense of well-being. It can help with some depression, along with exercise, but that's another thing. So BHRT is pretty important, and so if a woman is not feeling her libido, she probably should see a doctor and get a blood test and see where her sex hormones are. And it could be exactly the answer. Estrogen affects lack of estrogen affects the dry vagina and impacts orgasms too. Have you encountered that in your practice with older people?
Absolutely, and I think that's always very important. It's like always rule out anything medical.
Mm-hmm.
What I have found is that sometimes what will happen is her husband is also experiencing erectile dysfunction. And so they might not have as much outer course, or they think sex only equals intercourse, which is not true. Sex can as all sorts of juicy things. And
exactly.
So when the husband gets treated for erectile dysfunction and they try to resume intercourse, it's extremely painful for the woman because of the vaginal dryness. And so hormones can be extremely important, and obviously just vaginal lubricants as well.
Yes, and estrogen in topical form. Mm-hmm. Because some women are afraid to take it systemically, but topical form can make a difference too. But yes, the vaginal dryness, back in 1998, after Viagra was approved, there were a lot of so-called Viagra divorces, and that's because a lot of husbands who now can have an erection, they go to their wife, let's do it, and she says, you've got to be kidding me, you haven't paid attention to me for years. or maybe they did do it, having intercourse, and it was so painful for her because this is another thing, use it or lose it, along with the lack of estrogen. So, it can be very, very painful for the woman to have intercourse. So naturally, that's going to put her off. And of course, no pill in the world or treatment in the world will help a woman who hates her husband. So we've got that problem too. And with a woman with low desire, in addition to hormones being off, it could be a lot of stress. That's affecting couples of all ages these days. Fatigue, depression, maybe grief. We've talked about grief some, negative body image, and also unresolved issues from childhood, such as sexual abuse, and continuing arguments and feelings of anger between the mates may exist, too. Ashley,
sorry about that. There's a hurricane happening here, and our electricity went out.
Your electricity went out. Oh, my goodness. And is the hurricane... what other signs are you seeing of the hurricane?
Well, right now, I mean, because we live in a valley, I'm not near an ocean, but it's been high winds and heavy rain all day long. So it's just the everything, and now there's lightning, so things have kind of picked up here.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you're back. And
yes.
So while you were gone, I talked about some other possibilities for women with low desire and stress, fatigue, depression, negative body image, unresolved issues from childhood, sexual abuse,
yes.
arguments and feelings of anger between the mates. And all of these can sap sexual desire. I think these days with the pandemic, with Corona, and with the protests and all of the stress and anxiety that exists, that lots of women are feeling too much stress, too much anxiety to feel sexual desire. And one thing that I like to suggest, and maybe you do it too, is just do it. And research suggests that for more than half the population, sexual desire doesn't just happen. And desire may not precede arousal, and most women have to be physically stimulated to feel desire. So women who think they need to be in the mood to have sex might, in fact, need to have sex to get in the mood.
Absolutely. And I think that's the one thing is that they've tried to say, oh, well, is there any pill or any magical pill that helps women's sexual desire? Well, the biggest sexual organ is between a person's ears. So desire may not happen right away. It's just that's why I know a lot of couples are against this, but they find it extremely helpful of scheduling sex, saying like, this is our date night because and they make it happen. And then once, I hear this all the time, like once the woman is into it, the desire comes.
Yes, it does. And that's why I devoted a whole chapter to plan your date night at home and putting sex on the calendar, scheduling sex. And we get a little bit of pushback from that because people have this idea that sex should always be spontaneous, and it isn't any good if it isn't spontaneous. And that's simply not true. Probably that last myth comes from a lot of the Hollywood movies where people fall into each other's arms with all this passion. and yeah, we got to schedule it these days.
Absolutely, especially with everyone's busy schedule.
Yes. I talk about DINS, double income no sex syndrome, and TTFS syndrome, too tired for sex. So putting sex on the calendar is the way to go. And within that plan, you can have a lot of fun.
Absolutely. And I always, if I have couples that are experiencing certain sexual dysfunctions or discomfort around sex, I even start small sometimes. Just scheduling sexy time, whether it is watching an erotic film together, talking about sex, like whatever it is, just scheduling something around touch or just sexy. I call it sexy time because it kind of helps them get their feet wet without fully jumping in. Because some of us, I hear that like not everyone is ready to fully jump in, and I validate that, but I still think it's important to have that date night and have some sort of intimacy, whatever that looks like for that person or that couple.
I really like that approach so much, and I say something very similar. At the very least, lie naked together and touch, because I just happened to come from the hair salon where everybody's masked up and 6 feet apart, but my hair cutter was saying that she has some older people who live alone who are coming in to finally get touched, at least on their head when they're getting a shampoo.
Yeah.
It's, and I've known that for years, that little old ladies will often do that. They'll go to the hairdresser a lot just to be touched. It's a terrible problem. So for people who live alone, and we need touch. We need the comforting, healing touch. And if we're lucky enough to have a partner, make the most of it. That's the kind of the core message of my book, Love in the Time of Corona. Make the most of it and enjoy the touching. I like that you say it doesn't have to be full, but it's sexy time, touching, massaging. What else do you suggest for your clients?
Even reading erotic novels to each other. I have clients that sometimes will do that. Watching erotic films, whatever type of, maybe one person has a certain type of porn that they really, really like to watch, and sharing it with your partner and watching it together. Also just, talking about desires and fantasies together.
Yes.
I think that is extremely important because a lot of times that people, if you've been together for so long, you have made your sex life fit into this little box that, like, you find what works, and that works, and you have a hard time getting out of that box. But you still have fantasies. Those don't just go away. So talk about those fantasies. Like, what do you fantasize about? What do you want to try? I sometimes think that can just open the door to great conversation and intimacy, and potentially maybe having like sex or exploring together.
Yeah, fantasy is really important. The most common sexual fantasy is sex with someone other than your regular partner. And Rodney Dangerfield, some of the older listeners will remember, maybe even you do, the comedian.
I do, yeah.
So he described the time that he and his wife wanted to make love, but were very slow in making things happen. And he asked her, "What's the matter? Can't you think of anyone either?" So coming up with somebody new. But in the early stages of a relationship, of course, the brain produces a lot of dopamine, the hormone of arousal, and dopamine needs novelty. We're turned on by novelty. And so married people, especially married people who've been together a long time, I think need to create an illusion that somehow they're with a stranger. And here's where fantasy comes in. And your idea of watching porn together can be fun, too. And I think especially female-produced porn is usually a little more focused on the relationship. And it's still explicit, but it isn't just a lot of hard fucking, which some porn... It's gotten a little bit better over the years, but some porn does that. It's more male-oriented.
Right. And it's more,
female porn, my good friend Candida Royale, who passed away almost 5 years ago of ovarian cancer, but she was a friend for 20 years, and she was I've talked about her on this program before. In fact, she was on this program back in, I want to say 2013. Anyway, a wonderful woman and a real pioneer because she was the first producer, director of erotica for couples to watch that was female pleasure-oriented, where there was a plot and how come this couple's getting it on? Well, they're in a relationship and they actually like each other.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I like some of your ideas, though. This is very good. Watching porn together and playing out some fantasies. Do you have any other ideas for our
role-playing? I think that brings the role-playing makes it, I don't know, I think it's about the stranger, the dopamine rush. I think that's extremely important. Also, trying something completely new, like incorporating a little bit more kink into your relationship, I think can be extremely helpful. Just something different. That variety, something different can create that excitement. That excitement
and more dopamine. Yep. You told me off the air that you have a few of your older people in your practice who are actually into kink and maybe even polyamory. Can you expand on that and still keep in their confidentiality? Because we therapists know how to talk, and I put cases in my book, of course, and you just change some of the details and keep the confidentiality that way. But can you talk about some of your older people that are into some kink?
Yeah, and I think that's something that people have a hard time wrapping their minds around as well is, it's hard enough for older adults are sexual. Of course they are. Yes. You're sexual from the day you were born until the day you die. And older adults are kinky. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
One of my clients came to kink later in life after her divorce, and she met a person who was poly and kinky, and it ignited something in her that she hadn't felt in years. So they incorporate in the BDSM community, they often call it play, and they play and they try different things, whether it's waxed play, whether it is a flogger. It's all they keep it. I would say they keep it spicy, and there's and they're open, and so there is whatever kink that the primary partner doesn't want to do, there's another partner that likes different things. So, and they are able to talk about it. They talk about their jealousy. They talk about their fantasies. And it's really, really wonderful to see that. They're just very open, and it does create this juiciness in their relationship.
And, I think this is possible because there is maturity and life experience. You and I were talking off the air because we both know Nina Hartley, and who's still in the porn business. She's has been in. She's done over 1,000 films. But you met her at a conference and you interviewed her on your show, and I've interviewed her on my show. Plus, I know her personally, and she gave you some good advice. Do you want to share that? Do you remember what you said? I did.
I'm trying to remember which advice was that?
Well, it was that couples in their early 20s probably should not open up their relationship.
Yes.
Because they're so much more likely to be jealous if they have a threesome, for example.
Yes. I think that, it's great advice because I think a lot, and also I don't think opening a relationship is going to fix a damaged relationship. I think you have to be on solid ground. You can't just be like, I'm not completely happy. Let's open up the relationship. Well, maybe figure out what's not making you happy. Talk about that. Get a good foundation and then think about opening up, because, jealousy is an emotion, and it's an emotion that everyone has probably experienced a couple of times in their life, if not more. But I think the difference is, if you're in a poly relationship and you're really openly communicating, you can talk about jealousy and those emotions that come up, the insecurity, in a mature way. And I'm not saying some 20-somethings can probably do this as well, but I think it's something that develops. I think lizard brain takes over a lot of times, and jealousy becomes a reaction rather than like, let's just discuss this. What is happening here? And so it is. I think Nita gave excellent advice there, because I don't think in your 20s you're always as mature enough to be able to handle that.
And you're right. And that's also why for many people, sex starts getting really good after 40, or maybe even for some people after 50. And Dr. David Snarch talks about this in terms of differentiation. I'm sure you're familiar with David Snarch.
Yeah, I love David Snarch.
Oh, good. Yeah. I figured you would.
That's one of my Passionate Marriages is one of my favorite books, and I refer clients to that all the time. It's I highly recommend it.
I do too. I refer people to Passionate Marriage too. To be differentiated can make for much hotter sex, because it eliminates the codependency in a relationship, and you don't need validation for everything through your partner. You can stand on your own 2 feet, and you can then merge with another when you're making love and not have fears, because you're differentiated. You are an individual in and of yourself. Yeah.
And you can claim your own pleasure.
You can even express it a little bit better. Can you talk a little bit more about differentiation?
It's interesting that you say that. I'm actually doing postgraduate studies in family systems, and they talk a lot. That's where differentiation started. It was Dr. Murray Bowen. And
yes, that's right.
So I've been studying that this is my 3rd year of just straight studying of family systems. So I find differentiation is something I've strived. When I learned the term when I was 22, I'm like, that is my goal in life, is to be as differentiated as possible. And
good, Ashley.
And I'm still on that process. We're all growing, but it's really about one's ability to hold on to oneself and also be close to another. And I always call it the relationship. I call it a 1 + 1 = 3 relationship. Is that you are a complete person. the other person is a complete person, and you are both nurturing this relationship, which is also an entity in and of itself.
Yes, I love that. 1 + 1 = 3. And some people that marry, say, when they're in their early 20s and they don't really know themselves yet, they haven't had a lot of life experience yet, you do so much changing in your 20s. I told my daughter and son to wait till they were closer to 30 to get married because we do all of this changing in our 20s. But some people think, one half, if I'm not feeling fully differentiated or have a lot of self-confidence, right? One half and one half will make a whole, and that never works. One whole person plus one whole person can even as a couple then be more, equals 3. 1 + 1 = 3. I like that. It's a simple way to talk about it.
And I also look at it as obviously being able to validate oneself, like you said, but also being able to manage your own anxiety and not take on another person's anxiety. It's asking yourself is, who am I responsible for and who am I responsible to? And you're responsible for self. And how do you regulate self? How do you regulate your own anxiety? I think that's super important. And I think once you have that, once you achieve that level of differentiation, sex gets hot and passionate. Like, you're able to, own your pleasure. You're not always concerned about what the other person is doing. You're owning yourself. So true, and that's one reason why sex gets really hot. Sometimes in counseling, I'll ask the client to think about the difference between want and need, and ideally, if this client is getting serious about somebody, you ideally should be able to say, I want you even more than I need you. You know what? I can live without you, but I can live better with you. Yes.
Yes. So that's it. And that requires some life experience and some work and self-regulation. You talked about that. You're responsible for yourself and managing your own anxiety. All of those things. I put in the book, toward the end of the book, my book, Love in the Time of Corona. Take care. The number one, the list of 7 secrets for really good sex is take care of yourself first. And then number 5 is focus on your partner's pleasure. If you're taking care of yourself and tuning into your own pleasure, and there are times when you can do that, like if you're receiving oral sex, it's a very good time to do that. But focus on your partner's pleasure can be great, and you can do that without fear of losing yourself.
Yeah.
Because you can be more generous.
Absolutely.
And, I think focusing on your own pleasure first, and I actually say this in the book, do that first, but you're having, but still, you want to think about the other person, and I love to quote my husband because he does say this: "Worship your woman, and the goddess will reward you." So
I love
get
that.
Worshipped,
That's
and
great.
I like that a lot.
Yes, I want that on my wall.
Brian is very creative, and it really sums up his whole approach to. And I'm one fortunate woman, I must say. Worship your woman, and the goddess will reward you. And
Absolutely.
yes, when you're feeling cared for and being given pleasure, you want to be generous back, and you want to have your partner's best interests at heart.
Yeah.
And that let's use that as a segue into playful sex. because keeping it playful, one impression I get from the hours I spend with clients is that one of the most neglected sexual arts these days is laughter, true mirth. And I think couples would do better to be aware of the aphrodisia of laughter. And this can encourage and prolong pleasure. So change the pattern, change the place, change the approach, surprise your partner, change the response, change your style, and bring some humor in. I don't know if some of the younger people will know this reference, but there was a book called Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm, and she was very repressed. So if you've been Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm for 20 years, you probably won't want to jump out of the closet wrapped in saran wrap with a vibrator in each hand. But subtle changes might help, Being playful. How do you encourage your clients to be playful? Or I bet it's in your own relationship, lots of playfulness.
Yes, there's the old saying, laughter is the best medicine, and I guess, it doesn't say laughter is best for sex, but it is. I think that playfulness, I look at playfulness also as like creativity, and I think sex and sexuality is a place where you can really open up and be creative and playful. And I think, maybe this is where the shame for a lot of people come in, but laughing during sex, and when sex isn't always perfect. It can be, there's all sorts of things with sex. There's sexual mishaps that happen, and I think it's so important to be able to laugh and just go with the flow and just play with it. I think it's so important. I've asked couples. I have some couples that will get sex games, whether it's like dice or a board game. You mentioned a board game in your book.
I do. It's called An Enchanting Evening.
Yes.
And it was a game developed by Barbara and Michael Jonas some 40 years ago, and it sold about 1 million copies. And it's just a wonderful board game. So, and in fact, in my book, I talk about it in the resources. And those resources, of course, I want people to buy my book, but those resources, which are in Chapter 8, learn more about sex. It's so important, isn't it, to learn more about sex for couples, because when we have more knowledge, we are less anxious. But I do talk about the game, and I'm looking at my book now to see on what page it is. But it's also up on my advice blog website, deardrdiana.com. And those resources, under the resources tab, are on there. But playing a game can get people talking and doing, but mainly talking. My friend and colleague, Dr. Lori Buckley, she's been a guest on this program many times, and she produced a little card game called CPR for Sex, and that stands for, just a second, I'm going to get the box so I don't missay it. But it's got some wonderful questions. You can mix up the card game and mix up the cards and really get talking. And here we are, CPR for Sex. C stands for connection, P for passion, and R for romance.
Aww.
And I'm going to give her a plug because this game can be found on stuffoflove.com. It's a wonderful game. It gets people talking, just as An Enchanting Evening does. And just as the sex menu in my Chapter 1, Get to Know Your Partner Better. A lot of couples haven't checked in with their partners about what they like in sex. They just assume.
Right.
And
yeah.
So go over the sex menu and talk about what you'd like to do. But laughter and being playful, oh my goodness. Do you know in Old English, the word for silly did not mean, something that just was lighthearted. It actually meant if you were silly, the Old English word was salag. If you had a good amount of salag, you were healthy and happy and prosperous. Isn't that good? So we need more salag in our lives. Silliness.
Absolutely. Yes. I think that's, I think laughter can help with everything. I think it lightens the mood.
Yes, can help with everything. And laughter, having a good laugh is like having a good cry. It's very it helps get the feelings out. It's so therapeutic, and
it's that cathartic release.
Cathartic. There's the word. I'm just thank you very much. Cathartic release is the word that I wanted, and then we feel better afterwards. And laughter is like internal jogging because it gets everything going, the circulatory system and the respiratory system and all of that. So before we run out of time, let's spend a little bit of time talking about using mindfulness. I think I have a whole chapter on it in my book, and I'm sure you use mindfulness not only in your work with clients, but maybe even in your personal life.
Yes.
And so, can you talk about mindfulness as you use it?
So, for me, mindfulness, and I think everyone might use it in a different way. To me, mindfulness goes kind of hand in hand with differentiation of self. If I am more mindful of self, it's like a step towards that differentiation. So for me, being mindful is I have a yoga practice that I do on a very regular basis. I try to, if I don't do yoga, I'm not talking about, I don't have a 30-minute meditation, which I commend people who have that great a meditation practice. But sometimes I'll do a 5-minute meditation here and there, or just take 10 deep breaths and just settle myself. And I find that when I am more mindful, and I think that goes with sex, is if you're mindful, if you're able to manage what is going on in your body, you're able to connect more.
That's such a good point. Can you just elaborate on that? I should say, though, before the music starts, because we're coming toward the end, that Ashley Mader, M-A-D-E-R, Dr. Mader, am I pronouncing your last name right?
Yes, you are.
Good. And you'll be back in 2 weeks, and we're going to continue this conversation and add to it how we can use cannabis to enliven sex. So we'll talk about that and more of this. But go back. I just didn't want the music to cut you off sort of without mentioning that people need to tune in 2 weeks to hear you again. So say more about what you were just talking about.
So I think with the mindfulness is that when you're able to control your breathing, which is part of tantric sex, but just being able to calm oneself, because a lot of times, if you're an anxious person, and we're living in an anxious time right now, so that's very real, that being able to calm yourself and bring yourself back, because it's kind of that owning your pleasure. You're also owning your anxiety and your own feelings, and being able to bring it back to self. That means that you're able to connect more. If you can kind of bring it down, you can get back into your body. That's why I love yoga so much. And I'm not talking doing handstands. That's cool if you want to do that. But I'm just breathing into your body and sending energy to those body parts is so important.
It is so important. Ashley, you've been a wonderful, wonderful guest. Thank you so much. and we'll talk again in 2 weeks.
Yes, thank you so much. This has been a great time.
Oh, for me too. I appreciate you, Ashley. Thank you, and I appreciate listeners. Bye-bye, everybody.
Happy feet.